The chandeliers glimmered like captured starlight, their crystals scattering golden reflections across the vast marble floor. Roses, both crimson and ivory, lined the aisles and tables, filling the air with a soft fragrance that mingled with the delicate notes of a live violin ensemble playing in the corner. Every detail of the evening seemed pulled from the pages of a fairy tale, a spectacle crafted to impress and enchant. Guests, dressed in glittering gowns and sharp suits, leaned into each other's whispers, their voices hushed yet brimming with anticipation. They had not been told exactly what tonight's event was, but the hints were strong enough: something romantic, something grand, something that promised to etch itself into their memories. At the center of this anticipation was Daniel. He entered the hall with the self-assured stride of a man who believed he could command a room simply by walking into it. His tailored suit hugged his frame perfectly, his smile polished, his eyes alight with confidence. To everyone present, he was the picture of charm and power, the kind of man who lived for dramatic gestures. Tonight was meant to be his ultimate one, a public proposal to the woman he had convinced himself was the love of his life. Clara, radiant in a shimmering gown that clung to her youth and ambition, stayed close to him, her cheeks flushed with excitement. She already imagined the way gasps would ripple through the crowd when he finally dropped to one knee. But beneath the elegance and romance of the scene, a thread of tension quietly wound itself around the air. There was someone else in the room, someone who moved without announcement or spectacle, yet carried a gravity that rivaled even Daniel's carefully rehearsed confidence. From the shadows of the upper balcony, where only a few staff members lingered, Sophia observed. Her gaze was steady, her posture unshaken, her presence unnoticed by the crowd. To the unknowing eye, she was just another figure in the backdrop of this glamorous night. But to fate, she was the quiet storm gathering strength. As Daniel laughed and charmed his way deeper into the evening's performance, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Beneath the glitter and applause, an unseen drama was waiting to unfold, one that would shatter the illusion of perfection. No one among the glittering guests realized it yet, but tonight was not the beginning of a fairy tale. It was the opening act of a reckoning. Daniel was the kind of man who drew attention the moment he walked into a room. Tall, broad-shouldered, and armed with the practiced smile of someone used to winning people over, he had built his career on charm as much as intelligence. His business acumen was undeniable. He knew how to strike deals, how to persuade investors, how to transform opportunities into wealth. Yet beneath the polished exterior lay a streak of selfishness that even his closest friends quietly acknowledged. He was the man who pursued what he wanted without pause, the man who convinced himself that consequences were minor obstacles compared to his desires. For Daniel, love had always been less about devotion and more about conquest. Sophia, in contrast, was the embodiment of quiet strength. She had once been known only as Daniel's wife, the elegant woman who stood beside him at charity galas, corporate dinners, and weekend retreats. But anyone who truly looked at her saw more than a decorative spouse. She possessed a sharp intelligence, a graceful poise, and a determination that seemed unshakable. When their marriage ended in betrayal, many expected her to crumble under the weight of humiliation. Instead, she turned the ashes of heartbreak into the foundation of something far greater. With a mixture of vision and relentless effort, she became the owner of one of the city's most prestigious wedding venues, the very hall where Daniel now sought to stage his grand gesture. To her, it was not just a business. It was proof that pain could be transformed into power, that dignity could be reclaimed even when love was lost. Then there was Clara. Young, ambitious, and captivated by the glittering promises Daniel dangled before her, she had slipped easily into the role of his mistress. To her, Daniel represented a life she had always dreamed of: lavish trips, sparkling jewelry, dinners in the kind of restaurants she once only saw in magazines. She believed, perhaps naively, that Daniel's devotion to her was real, that she was the woman who had inspired him to risk everything. His wealth and confidence made her feel chosen, special, and irreplaceable. She never asked too many questions about his past, because the present felt too sweet to spoil with doubt. The history between Daniel and Sophia was complicated, layered with both passion and pain. They had met when Daniel was still rising in his career, ambitious but not yet fully formed. Sophia, with her elegance and wit, had been the perfect partner for his climb. Their love story began with whirlwind romance, late-night talks, promises of forever, and the intoxicating belief that they could conquer the world together. For a time, they did. Their marriage was filled with glamorous moments, but also genuine tenderness. Sophia believed she had found her soulmate, and Daniel, at least in those early years, seemed to believe the same. But as Daniel's wealth grew, so did his appetite for more. Business success emboldened him, made him feel untouchable. He began to crave not just money, but validation, admiration, and constant excitement. The vows he had once spoken with sincerity became chains he longed to break. When he first strayed, it was in secret, with the confidence of a man who thought he could have both loyalty and freedom without consequence. Sophia's discovery of his betrayal shattered her. The woman who had once been his partner, confidant, and greatest supporter suddenly found herself questioning every memory, every word, every kiss. The divorce was inevitable. Painful, yes, but Sophia refused to be defined by Daniel's choices. She walked away not as a victim but as a woman determined to rebuild. While Daniel paraded his new relationships and indulgences, Sophia poured her energy into her vision. Brick by brick, she created her empire, turning her grief into fuel. The wedding venue became her crown jewel, a place of beauty, resilience, and independence. Daniel, meanwhile, convinced himself he had traded up, that Clara was the future he deserved. What he never realized was that while he repeated old patterns of indulgence, Sophia was rising higher than he ever imagined she could without him. And as fate would have it, the very stage he chose for his triumphant proposal was one she owned, one that carried her fingerprints in every detail. Clara had always told herself that life was about climbing, about reaching for the things she deserved, no matter how impossible they seemed. Growing up, she had looked through glossy magazine spreads of women in glittering gowns, women stepping out of cars that gleamed like mirrors, women who lived in penthouses above the clouds. To her, they were the proof that some people really did live like royalty. And when Daniel walked into her life, with his tailored suits, his confident laughter, and the intoxicating scent of money that seemed to follow him, she believed she had finally stepped into the pages of that fantasy. Every gesture of his fed into her conviction that she had won. Every gesture of his fed into her conviction that she had won. The weekend getaways where she could drape herself in designer dresses he bought her, the dinners in restaurants that had names whispered like secrets among her peers, the diamond earrings that sparkled whenever she turned her head under the light, these were all tokens of victory. She told herself that she was not just another woman in his life, she was the woman. Unlike his ex-wife, she imagined herself as adaptable, as vibrant enough to keep his attention. She would give him the excitement he craved, the youth and energy that Sophia, in Clara's eyes, could never sustain. Her fantasies were elaborate, sometimes bordering on delusion. She pictured herself hosting parties in sprawling estates, walking red carpets at events with Daniel's arm around her waist, photographers shouting her name. She imagined traveling across continents without the slightest worry about money, a life where she would be admired, envied, perhaps even hated, but never ignored. Daniel had told her countless times that she was different, that with her he felt alive again. Those words alone were enough to silence the nagging doubts that sometimes crept into her thoughts late at night. Not all of her friends shared her enthusiasm. A few of them squealed with excitement, convinced that she was about to secure a future women only dreamed of. They urged her on, telling her she had done what others couldn't. She had captured the heart of a man who had already lived through marriage and chosen her over the respectable wife. But others were more cautious, their warnings softer but persistent. Men like him don't change, one friend told her over coffee, stirring her cup with slow, deliberate motions. If he betrayed once, he'll betray again. Another friend, less kind, called her foolish outright, reminding her that the same charm he used to lure her could be turned on someone else tomorrow. Clara brushed it all aside. To her, their warnings sounded like jealousy, envy wrapped in concern. They didn't see the way Daniel looked at her, didn't hear the promises he whispered when it was just the two of them. He spoke of futures, of rings, of homes together. Surely a man who had already tasted marriage wouldn't promise such things lightly. Surely, she reasoned, she had managed to give him what no one else could. What Clara didn't know was the truth hidden behind the velvet curtains of the venue. She admired the chandeliers, the polished marble floors, the way the entire place seemed like it had been designed for a queen. To her, it was simply Daniel's extravagant choice, proof that he wanted to celebrate their love in grandeur. She never asked whose vision had created such elegance, never thought to wonder who owned it. If she had, she might have noticed the name whispered with respect among the staff, the reputation that lingered in the city's social circles. But Clara remained blind to it all, floating on the illusion that tonight was about her triumph. As she prepared for the evening, slipping into her dress and imagining the moment when Daniel would kneel before her, Clara was certain of only one thing. This was the night she would be crowned as his forever. She had no idea that the crown she dreamed of wearing was already tarnished, and that the woman she thought she had replaced was silently waiting in the wings, ready to turn her fantasy into ashes. Sophia moved quietly through the grand hall, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor as she inspected the final touches of the evening's preparations. The staff, well-trained and devoted, adjusted the flowers, polished the glassware, and ensured the lighting fell in just the right places. To anyone else, she was merely a dignified businesswoman overseeing her empire, calm and collected as always. But behind her composed expression lay a storm of curiosity. She had been informed weeks ago that a prominent businessman had booked her venue for a private event, something special and extravagant. The staff mentioned his name, Daniel, and though she had trained herself not to flinch at it, the familiar weight of it pressed on her chest like a shadow from another life. At first, she had considered canceling the booking. After all, the venue was hers, and she owed him nothing. Yet the thought had passed quickly. Sophia was not the woman she had once been, the woman who reacted emotionally, who let her ex-husband's choices define her actions. No, she was something stronger now. She told herself she would treat him like any other client. Professionalism came first, and pride demanded it. If Daniel thought he could return to the world she had built and rattle her, he would find himself mistaken. Still, she couldn't help but wonder what he had planned. The scale of the arrangements, the lavish decorations, the secrecy surrounding the guest list, everything hinted at a display meant to impress. A product launch, perhaps, or a high-profile business celebration. But there was an undertone of intimacy, something different. The roses, the music, the way he had requested specific lighting for the center of the hall, it was more personal, more romantic. Sophia's instincts whispered that he was staging a performance not for the world, but for one person. She stood at the edge of the balcony, hands resting lightly on the polished railing, and looked down at the glittering hall below. There was an odd satisfaction in knowing that this space, which had risen from the ruins of her heartbreak, now stood as a monument to her resilience. When Daniel left her, when the truth of his betrayal surfaced, she had thought she would never recover. But instead of falling apart, she poured her grief into ambition. Every chandelier, every gilded arch, every rose placed on a table was a piece of her healing, a declaration that she could build beauty even from pain. Tonight, the venue shone so brilliantly it was hard to believe it had been born from loss. A quiet conflict stirred within her. Part of her wanted to ignore the evening entirely, to retreat to her private office and leave Daniel to his spectacle. Another part of her, however, felt the pull of unfinished business. Did she want to see what he had become? Did she want to witness him playing the same role he had once performed for her, this time for someone else? She wasn't sure. Pride urged her to stay away, but curiosity urged her to stay close. She lingered in the shadows, blending into the architecture of her own creation, unseen by the bustling staff and unaware guests. Watching the tables being set, the roses adjusted just so, the musicians rehearsing their notes, she felt an unexpected calm. This was her world now, her empire, not his. Whatever Daniel planned, however grand or foolish it might be, it was unfolding under her roof. That thought alone gave her a sense of quiet triumph. The irony was almost poetic. Years ago, he had tried to break her, to strip her of dignity and worth. Tonight, he would try to dazzle someone else in the very space she had built from the wreckage he left behind. Whether or not he knew it, Daniel was stepping into her story, not the other way around. And as Sophia remained still, hidden in the dim light of the balcony, she allowed herself a small, knowing smile. Whatever was about to happen, it would happen on her terms. The moment had been orchestrated with the precision of a stage play. Daniel, perfectly confident, held Clara's hand as he guided her through the glittering hall toward the center where the chandeliers shone brightest. The polished marble reflected their silhouettes as if even the floor itself wanted to magnify the drama of the evening. Guests rose to their feet instinctively, clapping in rhythm with the music that swelled around them. The violinists shifted seamlessly into a romantic melody, their bows gliding across the strings with practiced grace. Clara's cheeks flushed a deep pink, her smile trembling on the edge of laughter and disbelief, as though she could hardly believe she was the star of this fairy tale scene. Every step Daniel took was purposeful, rehearsed, designed to dazzle. His suit seemed to catch the light at all the right angles, his hair immaculate, his smile broad enough to suggest certainty but soft enough to hint at tenderness. He had always been a performer, and tonight was his grandest show. Clara leaned into him, aware of every eye in the room following her, her pulse quickening at the thought that she was moments away from becoming the future Mrs. She felt the weight of admiration pressing in from all sides. This was the kind of public validation she had dreamed of. When they reached the center, Daniel paused. The crowd hushed, the music softened, and a silence spread like anticipation before a curtain rises. Clara placed her hand delicately against her chest, as though steadying her heart. Daniel, with a flourish that seemed to echo every romantic gesture from the movies, sank onto one knee. Gasps rippled through the audience, followed immediately by an outpouring of applause and cheers. The velvet box in his hand snapped open, revealing a ring so dazzling it seemed to emit its own light. Clara's breath caught, her eyes wide, her lips parting in awe. "Clara!" Daniel's voice rang out, strong and rehearsed, carrying easily over the hall. "You are the love of my life. The one who makes me whole, the one who has given me joy I never knew before. Tonight, in front of everyone we hold dear, I ask you, will you marry me?" For a moment, time seemed to suspend. Clara's hands trembled, her eyes glassy with tears, the image of perfection. The beautiful young woman, overwhelmed by a proposal so extravagant it could have been written by fate. She opened her mouth to respond, and the crowd leaned forward as one, eager to hear the single word that would seal the fairy tale. But before Clara could speak, another sound cut through the room, the deliberate click of heels descending the grand staircase. It was slow, unhurried, yet it commanded attention more forcefully than the music or the cheers had. One by one, heads turned toward the staircase, and the room's energy shifted like a sudden gust of cold wind. At the top of the staircase stood Sophia, draped in a gown of understated elegance. Her presence radiated authority without her needing to say a word. The chandeliers caught in her hair, glinting like a crown, and the faintest smile curved her lips. She was not rushing, not interrupting with chaos, but instead entering as though she had been scripted into the moment by destiny itself. Her calm, poised descent silenced the crowd more effectively than any announcement could have. Daniel's face, frozen mid-performance, lost its confidence in a single instant. His mouth tightened, his jaw stiffened, and the color drained slowly from his cheeks. He had expected applause, adoration, and congratulations, but not this. Clara, still kneeling in her own shock, blinked up at the unfamiliar figure, confusion etched into her features. Who was this woman who could halt the momentum of such a grand moment with nothing but her presence? Whispers began weaving through the hall, guests leaning into one another, their murmurs like ripples spreading across water. "Isn't that Sophia? Wait, she owns this place, doesn't she? Isn't she his ex-wife?" The speculation buzzed, climbing higher with each word, the weight of gossip crashing down over the spectacle Daniel had planned so carefully. Sophia reached the final step and paused, her gaze sweeping across the room before settling on Daniel. She said nothing, but her silence carried more power than a speech ever could. The guests, caught between awe and discomfort, fell still, waiting for the inevitable clash. Clara, trembling, looked from Daniel to Sophia, realization dawning slowly, painfully, like a curtain being pulled back on a truth she hadn't wanted to see. The music had stopped without anyone instructing it to. The violinists sat frozen, their bows resting midair, eyes fixed on the drama unfolding. The applause had died, leaving only the sound of Clara's shallow breathing and Daniel's attempt to maintain composure. What had been intended as a fairy tale moment was transforming, second by second, into something raw, shocking, and unforgettable. The center of the hall no longer felt like a stage for romance, but a battlefield where secrets would soon be unearthed. All eyes followed Sophia as she stepped forward into the full glow of the chandeliers, her movements steady and regal, like someone born to command a room without ever raising her voice. The silence deepened, an almost tangible weight pressing down on the guests as they waited for her to speak. Sophia's gaze lingered on Daniel first, sharp, unflinching, before sweeping to Clara, whose bewildered expression betrayed her complete lack of understanding. At last, Sophia turned her attention to the crowd, her voice smooth, calm, and resonant enough to carry across the hall without effort. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her tone layered with both warmth and steel. "I hope you are enjoying yourselves tonight. Welcome to my venue. This hall, these chandeliers, the roses, the music, all of it is mine. My pride, my creation, and my home." Gasps fluttered through the crowd, a chain reaction of recognition sparking between guests who had heard rumors but never connected the threads until this moment. Daniel's composure shattered, almost audibly. His jaw twitched, his shoulders stiffened, and though he forced a smile, the blood had drained from his face. He hadn't expected her. Not here, not now, not in the very place he thought he owned for the night. Clara's eyes darted between them, confusion clouding her face. She clutched Daniel's arm, leaning closer, whispering in a frantic hush, "What does she mean? Who is she?" Daniel didn't answer, his silence only fueling her panic. Sophia's gaze returned to him, unwavering. A faint smile curved her lips, not of kindness but of someone who understood irony too well. She tilted her head slightly, as though savoring the moment, before delivering words that pierced the room like a knife. "Funny how life works," she said, her voice steady but edged. "The man who broke my vows now kneels under my roof." The hall erupted with murmurs, gasps loud enough to echo off the walls. Guests exchanged wide-eyed looks, their whispers swelling into a tide of scandal. "She's his ex-wife. She owns this place. Did he know?" The embarrassment was palpable, a thick fog of judgment and disbelief settling over Daniel and Clara like a shroud. Daniel tried to recover, rising from his kneel with a nervous laugh that rang hollow. "Sophia, this isn't necessary. We don't need to make a scene here." But his voice cracked slightly, betraying his fear. For once, the man who thrived on performance found himself unable to control the script. Clara, still gripping his arm, stared at him in horror. "Ex-wife," she whispered, the words tasting bitter as they left her lips. She looked back at Sophia, suddenly recognizing the elegance, the quiet strength that radiated from her. This wasn't just some stranger interrupting. This was a woman who had lived the very promises Daniel had once sworn to Clara, only to be discarded when something newer and shinier caught his eye. Sophia, however, did not falter. She didn't raise her voice or shed tears. She didn't rage or plead. She stood with poise, her words carefully chosen, her dignity a shield. "I won't take much of your time," she continued, her gaze sweeping over the guests who now hung on every syllable. "I only thought it fitting that you know whose walls you stand within. And perhaps, Daniel, you might reflect on the irony of declaring eternal devotion in a place built from the ashes of promises you once broke." The room was electric with tension. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, others leaned forward eagerly, drinking in every word as though they were spectators at a play. Clara, meanwhile, felt her fantasy cracking under her feet. The dream she had carried, the idea that she was the chosen one, the woman Daniel truly loved, suddenly felt flimsy, fragile, and false. The applause she had imagined resounding in her ears was replaced by a different kind of noise. The whispers of judgment, the sharp intake of breath from strangers who pitied her more than envied her. Her hands trembled as she stepped slightly back from Daniel, her eyes glassy as she tried to reconcile the charming man she thought she knew with the cold reality Sophia's presence had revealed. It wasn't just that he had a past, everyone did. It was the humiliation of realizing that she was not a new beginning, but part of a pattern, another chapter in a story he had been repeating for years. Sophia did not stay to bask in the discomfort. With a graceful nod to the guests, she stepped aside, her heels clicking against the marble as she withdrew just enough to leave the spotlight where it now burned hottest, on Daniel and Clara. She had said her piece, and it was enough. The rest of the evening would unravel without her needing to utter another word. Daniel swallowed hard, his confidence evaporating under the weight of dozens of eyes fixed on him. Clara's breath came fast, shallow, her body rigid as though she might collapse under the humiliation. The proposal, meant to be a triumph, had twisted into a nightmare in seconds. The stage Daniel had built for his love story had been stolen, and the woman he thought was long behind him had turned it into a theater of truth. Daniel straightened his shoulders, forcing a strained smile across his face, as though the strength of his charm alone might undo the damage Sophia's words had wrought. He slipped the ring box back into his pocket with a quick, almost desperate motion, then reached for Clara's hand as if grounding himself through her presence. Clara clung to him instinctively, her nails digging lightly into his arm, though her expression betrayed the panic swelling inside her. The room was a hive of whispers, every guest buzzing with speculation, their gazes darting between the three figures at the heart of the drama. "Let's not do this here," Daniel said finally, his voice tight but controlled, each syllable carefully weighed to appear calm. "We don't need to drag private matters into a public celebration." His eyes flicked toward Sophia, searching for some sign of retreat in her, but there was none. She stood still, elegant, composed, the faintest glint of amusement shimmering in her eyes as though she had already anticipated every move he would make. Sophia tilted her head slightly, her lips curving in a smile that was neither cruel nor forgiving. It was the smile of someone who had survived, who no longer needed to rage because the truth itself was weapon enough. "Oh, but it isn't private anymore, is it, Daniel?" she replied softly, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "You made it public when you staged a spectacle here, in front of these people, declaring promises you've broken before." The murmurs among the guests grew louder. Some leaned closer to one another, sympathy etched into their faces as they looked toward Sophia. Others turned their attention to Clara, curious to see whether she would crumble or stand by him despite the humiliation. Daniel's jaw tightened. "This is not the time for old wounds. We've both moved on." Sophia's laugh was low, controlled, with no trace of bitterness, only certainty. "Moved on? Is that what you call it?" "I call it a pattern. You promised me forever, and when the shine wore off, you wondered. You looked me in the eye and told me I was your only one, even as you were building secrets with others. And when I discovered the truth, you didn't apologize, you justified yourself. Do you remember that, Daniel? You said a man like you deserved more than one heart to come home to." The crowd stirred with shock, gasps escaping from lips too stunned to hide their reactions. Clara froze, her grip on Daniel's arm loosening. Her breath came shallow as she processed Sophia's words, each one landing like a stone dropped into her chest. The same lines, the same promises, the same arrogance. Suddenly, she realized they weren't unique to her. She was not the exception, she was merely the continuation. Daniel shifted uncomfortably under the weight of so many eyes. He raised his chin, his voice laced with forced indignation. "You're twisting this. I gave you everything, Sophia. The life you lived, the opportunities, the comfort. You think those came from nothing? I built them, and I built them for us." Sophia didn't flinch. "You built them, yes, but I stood beside you while you did. I gave you trust, loyalty, and faith when you had none. And when you discarded me, I built something of my own. Look around you, Daniel." She gestured gracefully to the hall, the glowing chandeliers, the roses filling the air with their fragrance. "This is mine. Not a gift from you, not a remnant of what we had. Mine. Created from the ruin you left behind." The applause was subtle but real. Several guests, overcome by the gravity of her words, clapped softly before catching themselves, embarrassed at their own instinct. Clara, however, felt no admiration in that moment, only devastation. Her mind reeled back to every sweet word Daniel had whispered, every promise of permanence. The pieces fell into place with painful clarity. If he had done this to Sophia, what would stop him from doing the same to her? She was standing in the shoes of a woman who had once believed she was chosen, only to be betrayed. "Clara," Daniel whispered urgently, trying to draw her attention back to him, but she pulled slightly away, her gaze locked on Sophia. In the older woman she saw not just elegance but truth, the kind of truth that made her stomach churn. Desperation began to edge into Daniel's tone as he faced the guests. "This isn't fair. Everyone here knows relationships are complicated. Nobody is perfect. Sophia and I, we had our differences, but we've both moved on. I've chosen Clara, and that's what matters now." Sophia's eyes narrowed, though her voice never rose. "You've chosen Clara," she repeated, her words deliberate, echoing through the room like a verdict. "Just as you once chose me. Just as you will choose someone else when the time comes. It isn't love you seek, Daniel. It's adoration, validation, attention. You collect hearts like trophies, only to discard them when you tire of the shine." The hall was silent, the truth pressing down heavier than any outburst could have. Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came. Every attempt at defense only seemed to confirm what Sophia said, every flicker of his charm looking more like desperation than authority. Clara felt the ground tilt beneath her, the fantasy of the evening unraveling thread by thread until she was left standing in the ruins of a dream she had thought belonged only to her. The confrontation had become more than just an interruption to a proposal. It was an unveiling, a revelation of the man Daniel truly was, told not with screams or accusations, but with calm, devastating precision. And as the guests watched, their loyalties shifting silently toward Sophia, Daniel's empire of lies crumbled one measured word at a time. Clara stood frozen in the center of the hall, her hand still half-locked in Daniel's, though her fingers felt limp, lifeless, as though they no longer belonged to her. Her cheeks burned, not with the shy blush she had expected to wear tonight, but with the searing heat of humiliation. The music had stopped, the guests' murmurs had grown into a low but persistent tide, and every glance seemed to cut into her like a blade. This was supposed to be her triumph, her glittering moment of being publicly chosen, of stepping into the life of luxury she had envisioned since Daniel had first swept her off her feet. But now, with Sophia's voice echoing through the vast hall, Clara's dream fractured into jagged pieces, each sharper than the last. Her mind scrambled backward through the months, chasing the trail of promises that had led her here. She remembered the dinners where Daniel had leaned across the candlelight, whispering that she was unlike anyone else he had ever met. She remembered the weekends away, where he painted pictures of a future together, a house by the lake, vacations in Europe, her wearing the diamond rings and gowns she had always secretly longed for. She remembered how her friends had asked, with a mixture of curiosity and caution, whether she was sure, whether she trusted him. Some had laughed with her, charmed by the idea of a wealthy man promising her the world. Others had warned her that men who cheated once could cheat again, that she might be walking straight into a trap. She had dismissed the latter with a toss of her hair, certain they were jealous, certain they could not understand. But now, Sophia's calm, deliberate words replayed in her mind like a haunting refrain. "Just as you once chose me. Just as you will choose someone else when the time comes." The truth of it pressed down like an unbearable weight. Clara's heart clenched as she realized she had heard those same phrases before, spoken in the same charming tone, the same practiced sincerity. "You're the only one. You're different. I've never felt this way before." How many times had he recycled those words, dressing them up as if they were meant solely for her? Clara's chest tightened. She wanted to cry, to scream, to demand an explanation from Daniel, but her throat felt locked, dry, useless. She could only hear the whispers of the guests around her, words carried on the air like poison. Poor girl. She thought she was special. She didn't even know who owns the place. Her humiliation was no longer private. It was etched into the eyes of everyone watching. Daniel squeezed her hand again, trying to reclaim her focus, but this time she pulled away. Her gaze flicked toward him, and for the first time she saw past the polished smile, past the confidence he wore like armor. She saw desperation, fear of losing face, fear of losing her not because of love but because without her, his performance would collapse completely. Her mind raced through flashes of memory. The first time he kissed her, the first time he gave her an expensive gift, the first time he spoke bitterly about Sophia, twisting their history to make himself the victim. Had she really been so blind? Each moment she once treasured now appeared tinged with manipulation, a careful orchestration to keep her dazzled while he pulled her deeper into his world. The guests' whispers grew louder, their eyes shifting between her and Sophia, waiting to see what she would do. Her humiliation was no longer just personal, it was public theater, and she was unwillingly cast in the role of the naive mistress. Clara's stomach churned as the decision rose before her like a cliff edge, to stay by Daniel's side, pretending his promises still held meaning, or to let go and walk away, exposing not just his betrayal but her own mistake in believing him. Standing by him meant clinging to the illusion, to the wealth, to the security she had thought she wanted. Walking away meant admitting she had been deceived, but it also meant reclaiming some shred of dignity. Her knees trembled. She wanted to believe there was still some truth in what Daniel had promised, that maybe she was the exception, maybe Sophia had just been the wrong match for him. But the look in Sophia's eyes, steady, unflinching, told her otherwise. Clara felt her illusions shatter completely, leaving her standing in the rubble of dreams that no longer glittered. As Daniel reached for her once more, Clara's hand hovered in hesitation. Around her, the hall seemed to pulse with expectation, the chandeliers shimmering as though they too were waiting for her choice. She realized in that moment that whatever she decided, nothing would ever be the same. The room still trembled with tension, the echoes of humiliation clinging to the gilded walls. But Sophia, standing at the foot of the staircase, did not waver. She looked neither at Daniel nor Clara, who both seemed paralyzed by the weight of their unraveling, but instead at the guests, men and women who had come expecting a fairy tale and instead had been handed a lesson in truth. Her expression carried no bitterness, no gloating satisfaction. For years, she had imagined what it might feel like to see Daniel exposed, but now that fate had placed the moment in her hands, she discovered she did not hunger for revenge. What filled her instead was calm clarity, a quiet triumph not born from his downfall but from her own resilience. She lifted her chin, her voice steady and smooth as silk as it floated across the silent hall. "I thank you all for joining us tonight," she said, her words carrying both authority and grace. "I hope you continue to enjoy the beauty of this venue, a place built not from bitterness, but from determination, and from the belief that even the deepest wounds can give rise to something lasting and strong." Her gaze swept over the guests, some of whom bowed their heads in admiration, others clapped softly in encouragement. None could deny the dignity with which she stood before them. Daniel's lips parted as though to speak, to salvage something, but Sophia's calm made him irrelevant. Clara, pale and trembling, stared at the ground, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Neither of them mattered anymore, not in the way they once had in her story. Sophia had already rewritten her role. She was no longer the betrayed wife, no longer the woman left in the ruins of broken vows. She was the architect of her own empire, the woman who had turned pain into power. With a graceful nod, she concluded, "Please enjoy your evening. This night is yours." Her words were simple, but in them was a depth no one could miss. She was not seeking applause, and yet it came, first in scattered claps, then swelling into a wave of appreciation. Guests rose to their feet, not out of obligation but out of genuine respect, their admiration echoing louder than the whispers that had filled the room earlier. Sophia turned, her gown gliding effortlessly behind her as she moved toward the exit. The chandeliers caught the light in her hair, casting her in a glow that seemed almost regal. Daniel and Clara shrank into the background, their moment of grandeur consumed by scandal. The guests' eyes no longer lingered on them. All attention belonged to Sophia. As the doors closed softly behind her, she left not as the wounded ex-wife, not as the woman overshadowed by betrayal, but as the queen of the night. Her silence had spoken louder than anger ever could, and in that silence lay her greatest triumph. In the days that followed the scandalous proposal, the story spread like wildfire across the city's social and business circles. What had been intended as Daniel's grand romantic gesture had transformed into a public humiliation, and the details were retold with an almost gleeful precision at dinner parties, cafes, and boardrooms. The phrase, "he proposed to his mistress at his ex-wife's venue," became a line whispered with equal parts disbelief and delight. The man who once prided himself on being untouchable now found his name etched in gossip columns and whispered behind champagne glasses, not as a titan of industry but as the fool who didn't even know whose roof he stood under. Daniel's business partners were among the first to recoil. Investors who once admired his charisma and confidence began questioning his judgment. A man who could be so careless in his personal life, they reasoned, might also be reckless in deals that required tact and foresight. Calls were left unanswered, meetings postponed, partnerships quietly dissolved. Invitations to high-profile events dried up, and where once he had been the center of attention, Daniel now found himself conspicuously absent from the circles that mattered most to him. His reputation, built painstakingly over years, crumbled faster than he could rebuild it. Clara, too, found herself facing an unfamiliar reality. The fantasy she had built around Daniel, the idea of being chosen, of finally stepping into the role of Mrs., shattered completely the night Sophia stepped onto the staircase. For days, she replayed the moment in her mind. The gasps, the whispers, the icy dignity with which Sophia revealed herself. Clara had thought she was stepping into a dream, but in truth, she had been walking straight into a cycle that had already destroyed another woman before her. That realization cut deeper than the humiliation of being exposed. She was not special. She was not the exception. She was simply another chapter in Daniel's long, selfish pattern. At first, she tried to cling to him, convincing herself that love, or at least desire, might still be enough to salvage something. But as the days passed and the gossip intensified, Clara began to see Daniel with new eyes. His apologies rang hollow, his reassurances flimsy. When she pressed him about Sophia, about whether there had been others before her, his evasions spoke louder than any confession. She began to notice the same manipulative charm that had once swept her off her feet, now looked like a well-rehearsed performance. The man she thought was her savior was, in fact, her undoing. Leaving him was not easy. It meant abandoning the luxury, the gifts, the glittering promises that had seemed so intoxicating. But Clara realized that staying would cost her something far greater, her dignity. Quietly, without the grand gestures Daniel loved, she walked away. For the first time in years, she began to confront her own ambitions, not the ones Daniel had dangled before her, but the ones she had buried beneath the weight of his attention. It was a painful unraveling, but it was also the beginning of something new. Meanwhile, Sophia's life carried on without disruption. The scandal did not taint her. If anything, it elevated her status. People admired not just her success as a businesswoman, but her composure in the face of what could have been a deeply humiliating moment. She had stood in grace, and the world noticed. Bookings at her venue increased as couples sought to marry under the chandeliers that had witnessed such a dramatic reversal of fate. Her empire expanded, her reputation only grew stronger, and those who once pitted her for being the woman Daniel betrayed now looked to her as an icon of resilience and strength. For Clara, rebuilding was slower. She had to face the whispers, the judgment, the painful knowledge that she had been part of someone else's tragedy. But over time, she began to find her footing. She sought new friendships, pursued work that gave her a sense of independence, and slowly, she pieced herself back together. The humiliation that had once threatened to break her became the fire that hardened her resolve. She would not let herself be another man's stepping stone again. She would learn, she would grow, and she would never forget the lesson Sophia's dignified strength had shown her. As for Daniel, he found himself alone. The mistress was gone, the ex-wife untouchable, and the business partners indifferent. Even his friends, those who had once laughed at his stories and admired his daring, began to distance themselves. He was left with a tarnished name, a hollow memory of a proposal that had turned into his downfall, and an empty apartment filled with reminders of a life that no longer admired him. The applause he had once lived for was gone, replaced by whispers he couldn't silence. In the end, Daniel's tragedy was not that he lost his wife, his mistress, or his business. His tragedy was that he lost himself, the carefully crafted image of a man adored and admired. Without that reflection staring back at him, he was nothing more than a hollow shell, a man undone by his own arrogance. And so the city remembered. They remembered Sophia, the woman who walked away with dignity and built an empire from her pain. They remembered Clara, who stumbled but learned to rise again. And they remembered Daniel, the man who thought he could orchestrate a fairy tale, only to discover that karma had written a far sharper ending. Sometimes, fate doesn't need to knock on your door. Sometimes, it books the entire venue and waits for you to walk right in.